Hey all you femi-nerds out there, this is Becca.
And this is Leigh.
And we have a thrilling episode of File 741 for you today. We are here with the creators of Kamikaze, which is an incredible comic that we discovered this last year at Dink. And so we're going to talk about the comic and how it came to be and all of that fun stuff. So if you guys don't mind giving us a quick introduction of who you are and what you do.
Sure thing. I'm Alan. I am the sort of the background artist and one of the co-creators of the comic. And I've been working on this project with these two fantastic co-creators for about 6-7 years.
My name is Carrie Tupper. I am the writer, ink and paint artist, and general, I guess, art director for the comic, and that's just kind of my job.
And I am Havana. I'm the lead character artist on Kamikaze. I've been working on this pretty much straight out of college back in 2011. Wow. And so,
Good God, it's been that long.
So I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're really happy to have you.
Absolutely.
So just as an introduction for our listeners, Kamikaze is a comic that is a kind of post-apocalyptic story. There is a huge global ecological disaster, and in this world there is a young woman named Markeisha Nin, and she is a courier for a company. She's trying to make sure that she has a living for herself and her father, and she ends up taking a job that things go pretty wrong pretty quickly, and so she gets mixed up in kind of this political game, and where she really has to work hard to figure out how to survive to take care of herself and her father. So I mentioned to you guys when I picked up the comic at Dink this year that it kind of really reminded me of Titan AE. That's one of my favorite films, and I love the style, I love the story, and so it just really drew me in. So if you don't mind sharing, what were your inspirations for this story? Where did it come from?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Titan AE, because I know Carrie and Alan definitely have some roots.
Yeah, I was going to say I didn't want to jump in quite first, but yeah, one of the first things Carrie and I bonded over in college was the fact we both had this mutual love for Titan AE. I thought it was a wonderfully fun departure from a lot of the other stuff that Don Bluth was doing at the time. And I was kind of that sci-fi nerd who loved the idea of spaceships and stuff like that. So that was a big fun for me. And I also thought it was a really fun sort of romp and stomp kind of adventure. And it was great to connect with Carrie originally through that.
Yeah, our the bonds of our marriage were formed in Titan AE.
Yeah, and I think I know when I came on board, one of the things that I think we hit it off all together pretty quickly, because we all just shared this idea of animation being a powerful medium for all kinds of storytelling, not just stuff for children or stuff for comedies. Those things are great too, but I think Titan AE, and I would say even Atlantis would maybe another example where I think, of course, there's things to be said about the execution of both movies, but the intention and the vision for both of those kind of resonated with us. Just like seeing animation as a tool for telling much deeper, more mature, more exploratory stories like that. And I know, another thing is we come from a generation where we grew up with a lot of cartoons on TV, like Gargoyles, the Batman animated series, Batman Beyond, all these great shows, and those shows never really grew up with us. I think all of us kind of found anime for a little bit to kind of fill that void of more mature storytelling in animation. So I think one of the things that we bonded over immediately was kind of this shared vision of wanting to pursue animation as a storytelling medium that can tackle adult themes and more mature, stories as well.
Yeah, what she said.
Very much what she said. I think a lot of it was also just the desire to, sort of going off of what Havana was saying, that sort of desire that when you're watching animation, even when it came to like Gargoyles or later on like Avatar: The Last Airbender or Legend of Korra, there was like a moment where you see where they're kind of going and what they're addressing, and they can step up to the line. And they can look at that line and say, wow, that's a really interesting line. I wish we could talk about it, but we have to turn around now. And I found that so frustrating because it was just like, okay, there's ways to talk about these subjects in animation. And I don't know, it's just because it's always considered this kids medium. It's sort of like we're depriving ourselves from actually telling stories in animation that actually talk about harder subjects that a lot of us still need to deal with. And because animation is often considered like a kid's storytelling medium, it's kind of like, I don't know, when I have more powerful reactions to animation than I do to live action. There have been very few live action films that I've been like, oh my gosh, this hits super hard, this hits home. For me, but if you watch something like Finding Nemo and you have that moment with Dory and she says, I'm home when I'm with you, like that just sort of tears your heart out and throws it in a blender and then tries to push it back together. So it's one of those things that I think can be pushed further, and actually maybe by adults embracing the idea of animation as a storytelling medium, we can become better adults for the generations coming forward, And
luckily, I do think that since we've started on the project, I think our attitude is starting to change. I mean, you see it reflected in the types of media now on Netflix and Hulu and Disney Plus and all that stuff. Like, I think, look at Steven Universe. They tackle some pretty intense and very complex, nuanced topics, and it's a kids show.
Yeah.
So I think, as Carrie said, there's definitely ways to do that. So I'm glad that I think maybe Hollywood is maybe starting to see that, but we'll see. And I also think that that's why the reception for Kamikaze has been so positive. Because we, as the people on the ground, kind of know that there is this desire for this stuff, but as we've learned from the past 7 years, it's gonna take a lot to kind of turn that ship in the actual industry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all those examples. Yeah, it feels like we talk a lot sometimes about how kids are much more thoughtful than we give them credit for, so we shouldn't shy away from those difficult topics. But it feels like either you have kids shows that are dealing with those topics, but that can't quite go that far, like Carrie said, or you have stuff like Aqua Teen Hunger Force, things that are like so like adult, quote unquote, but that aren't really dealing with real stuff.
Right. It's like all comedy, at least the adult Western animation world.
Right. And so, I really enjoyed Tuca and Birdie because it started to deal with some of those really intense things, but it was also very
loved it too.
Absurdist, yeah. So it's really nice to have something like Kamikaze, which deals with those things in a very grounded world, which brings us to our next question.
Yeah, the world feels so rich and diverse, but yet grounded. And we really love the sci-fi elements, but the human element makes it feel very real. So what made you decide to set the story in the future Earth rather than a different planet?
That's a great question. So when we first started working on Kamikaze, it was just Carrie and I, and we were back in college. And originally it was going to be sort of like a modern-day superhero parody. And it evolved a lot over the course of its growing up period. And I think a large part of what drove that evolution from that sort of modern day superhero parody to sort of the dystopian fiction story it is now is we were kind of paying attention to a lot of a lot of the problems in the world, and a lot of the problems that we saw, that either we were experiencing or our friends and family were experiencing, and we were trying to think about, like, all right, so how do we encapsulate this into a story world? And I think at some point we did talk very briefly about, setting it on some other, planet or something, but we decided that no, let's just go ahead and play this out as if, this is Earth, but significant things have happened along the way. Because I think ultimately that, like you guys are saying, it is a big part of the grounding of it. Like, it helps cement the realness of it, and we really wanted, as we were moving forward, for this to feel genuine and real and concrete. And I think that was a big influencer in that.
I think for me, my personal taste in sci-fi, like, I've learned recently that it's actually really hard for me to get into sci-fi with just like a ton of lore, and like the more removed from Earth you take me, like if you are like an alien species or totally made up other planet, the less interested I am. And I really always like the sci-fi where it's dealing with like human emotions. I always say Interstellar comes to mind, where it is sci-fi, but it's really talking about like the human emotions and like how this man deals with missing his kids' entire lives. And you can't really do that without the backdrop of this sci-fi world, even though it's like very grounded. I think like Kamikaze is similar. It's one of the semi-depressing things is like we make all these things up, and then like 6 months later we see it on the news. Right?
Yeah.
So it is a little like concerning, but I think this also gives us an avenue to deal with and explore these different ideas and conflicts as well.
Right. I think as we've been developing, and to your point about like the news articles coming out, I think for us, one of the reasons why I think it's important that it stays sort of like a future Earth is, while we are describing this sort of this post-apocalyptic dystopian world, it's the world rebuilding itself after all of that. So to a certain extent, there can be a tomorrow if something goes terribly wrong, and we can work together to make something better. It's not going to be perfect. In fact, it's got a long way to go to be perfect, but there can be something.
But that's not to say it's an idyllic situation.
Far from it.
Yeah, like it's still subject to human greed, anxiety, the distribution of wealth, and it's just human nature, basically. So it's been kind of an interesting sandbox to play in.
Right, and I think that to a certain extent, if we set it on like another planet, like that would have given us permission to really duck out of a lot of the harder topics that we end up talking about, or at least having as sort of like the big power dynamic set pieces of it. Because to your point about sort of like not being able to relate to like an alien species or something like that, we all have a pretty good intuitive sense of the world right now, so it's pretty easy to say, all right, so which things have gotten worse, which things have gotten better, and just really use what we know already as a solid jumping off point.
Yeah, and like so I'm the black sheep of the trio. I don't have an art degree, but I do have an international affairs degree. It's been also an interesting exercise in applying that kind of knowledge too.
And it's been so helpful too.
Yeah, it's like I'm not working in the field I studied for, but I'm applying it in very interesting ways. So, like, for example, in the world of Trinity, which is where the story takes place, like there are a few remaining areas of cropland, but however, those have been kind of hoarded up by these feudal houses that were once corporations, and they've kind of devolved into this like feudal state, and they're just hoarding all those resources. And of course, on the outsides are all these sprawling slums that we have, Outer Trinity and the Outlands. I think like outside the wall, it's almost anarchy, but the only order and authority that comes is from these like these gangs and militias that come about. And actually, like, a lot of that kind of came from a lot of history from, like, Somalia, for example. Or I really have looked, like, one of the houses in the past, they've tried to do a lot to help, like, outside Trinity, but there's still, like, an ulterior motive. So, like, for that, I took a lot of inspiration. Well, inspiration is the wrong word, but I took a lot of
Notes.
aspects of the relations between, like, China and a bunch of the African countries, for example. And just kind of like, yes, you're helping them, but there's also, it's not, like, completely charitable. So anyways, I'm drawing a lot of those influences and just making notes like, okay, in this world, like, what actually would be realistic, or what sort of dynamics would actually come from an environment like this.
Yeah, I think that's what makes this comic stand out so much too, is that complexity and the backstory. And in, you know, the printed comics, you have all these notes that you include with all of this extra information that as you're reading, you know, you're getting bits and pieces of, so it's not like you're missing anything if you don't have that, but it adds to this richness. And I think that's also why these characters are so interesting. It feels very complicated, you know. Orson has these connections to these houses, but he isn't necessarily the villain, quote unquote. And Markeisha is very relatable because she's dealing with very real issues of trying to find enough money to house herself and her father and feed herself, and she kind of gets caught up in this situation and has to, quote unquote, do the wrong thing in order to survive. So when it came to character design, did you have some characters that you were inspired by, some real people in your lives? And how did that factor into their actual design, what they looked like?
So to answer your question, I think what's really inspired a lot of the characters, at least from a development side, for me was because I grew up in basically a military town. There was a lot of expectations that were thrown onto kids really, really early, or at least in my area. So, like, I don't know, kids just grew up really independent really quickly. So, for example, I was making dinner for my mom when I was in the 3rd grade. Things like that. So I kind of wanted to take this idea of that same sort of, not necessarily independence, but like that is a survival skill. It's a survival trait, because if your parents are in the military or they're working all the time and you don't have anybody at home, then you have to learn to take care of yourself. And I think a lot of that independence came through in Markeisha, especially. Because she wants to be the person that helps out. She wants to be the breadwinner. She wants to be the person that, you know, her father can rely on. She wants to do good by her father. And she also wants to support him in his goals to become a novelist. But at the same time, you know, the realities of what's there is really, is sort of hanging over her head as sort of like this weird Damocles. And I guess one of the things that I learned in my youth was that as I turned 18, there was this expectation that you're an adult now, so you have to do and know everything about being an adult. And I didn't. I just didn't. I figured that, you know, if things started stacking and piling up, that I would just ignore them for a little while and then come back to them and then slowly work my way through them. But that isn't how the world works, and no one really told me that. Like, I was the kid that was able to compartmentalize and organize to a certain extent, but at the same time, it's like if I got really overwhelmed, I froze. And when you're an adult, apparently you can't do that. So it's sort of like that idea of Markeisha is like, she's 19 and about to turn 20, and she's like heaped all this pressure on herself, but at the same time is holding the same pressures of the world on top of that as well. That's the pressures that the world is putting on her outside of it. So for me, a lot of that was personal experience of just how overwhelming it can be.
Yeah, I think one of the things we try to aim for with a lot of our characters is each of them is sort of a composite of a lot of people that we know, and it tends to be a composite that's focusing on like a specific common thread we see people, a problem we see someone struggling with. So, with Marcatia, like Carrie is saying, so much of it's about sort of this desire to, have this sort of self-sufficiency and, to be the, all this pressure to be the provider and all of these, to kind of be driving both, herself and her dad towards, some sort of an ideal life. Other characters like Orson, he's a result of a lot of the things that have gone on in his life, where he does have these connections to sort of these powerful players inside the wall, but he's also not really all that keen on playing on their terms anymore.
Yeah, and I think with these characters, we also think about like what other characters out there are similar and how do we differentiate them. And I think that's maybe more of a technical discussion, but I know that so Marcatia was like this before Cora came out, but not Mike and Brian, so we didn't get it out there first. But I love the final character arc at the end. Sorry, spoiler alert for the last season of Legend of Korra for anyone who hasn't seen it. But in a nutshell, Korra is completely demoralized by the fight before in the previous season, and she spends the entire season kind of building herself back up, finding that inner strength again. And what I loved about that character arc is that with female characters in media, you either get one of two extremes. You either get someone who's completely helpless, who's a total damsel in distress, or you get, oh, I'm a badass, I have no weakness, she's just basically the Terminator. And with Marcatia, she is a badass, but she's also human. I also think that there is this unfortunate trend of women of color, especially black women, in media being very one-dimensional, where they gotta be strong, sassy black woman the entire time. She can't have any other character traits. I think with Marcatia, she's again, she's a 19-year-old. She didn't ask for this life, and she didn't ask for the situation she's in. She deals with it, so she's not she's not weak, and she doesn't let that fear paralyze her, but she does feel that fear, right? So I think we were very mindful of making sure we didn't fall into these common traps with female characters in general. Because I think even well-intentioned writers and creators fall into those traps, just because that's all we've seen in media, So of course we're going to have influence from that.
That's very insightful. Thank you for sharing. I think that says a lot about what you guys are doing, how much thought you're putting into it, and how much you recognize the impact that you can have.
And it's really hard to avoid tropes because there's just so many of them. So I think you guys have done a really great job of being mindful of that.
Right.
Oh, thank you.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, it is difficult because we not all tropes are bad, but we're trying to make sure that we make her human and also be mindful of her weaknesses. But at the same time, I know that we need to also make her an inspiring character. So she can't be a scaredy cat the whole time. She can't be an anxious wreck all the time. That's not going to be a compelling character to watch. So it is a delicate balance that we have to strike.
Yeah, it is. And especially within writing her, again, she's had a kind of tough life. Living in Trinity is not a fun time, really. So there's that whole idea that you have to kind of, I don't know what's the right phrase for it, but it's basically you just say screw it and just move forward. It's always it's always moving forward. And with Marcatia, I think that's what she has to do. It's I have a goal and this is the only viable way to get there. But at the same time, she has this vulnerability So, I mean, like, she's going to get scared, but she's not going to be an anxious wreck all the time, like Havana was saying. So I think part of the thing about finding a character's human qualities is that sort of knowing, like, what a definition of real bravery is like, it's being terrified, but doing it anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, like, as far as, like, other characters, I know our antagonist is interesting, but, like, Toro is our antagonist, and it's interesting, like, he is a gang leader, but because Outer Trinity is somewhat in anarchy, kind of, his gang actually instills order, and that's how they have power, because they have access to resources, and they instill kind of that, authority and all of that in Outer Trinity, which is kind of an interesting flip on typical gangs in media where they're fighting against authority, but this time he is the authority. And that is actually the issue, or like the antagonistic force as well. And I wanted Toro, at least, I mean, okay, I'm not the writer, but I try to influence Carrie as much as possible. But like with Toro, reading a lot about developing countries where there are lots of villages and cities where there isn't a lot of, like, legitimate government, a lot of militias do kind of rise up, and they provide access to education. They have access to food, get people fed. They provide, a justice system, even if it's a really, like, kind of primitive one. So it makes Toro a little more complex. He's not just bad to be bad, but he is greedy, and he's very motivated by staying in power outside of Trinity. And even though he's trying to, like, get the city under control, it's not necessarily like a good force. But I do like kind of playing with the shades of gray in that moral spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you two are saying.
Right.
I think ultimately what we try to do is we try to build in a lot of complexity and honesty into the characters and the conflicts we have. We just try to, we tend to let things marinate, a concept for a character or a conflict marinate for at least a month, and then pick it apart again. One of the best things which has happened for the development of this is the fact that while the three of us live and work in Atlanta, Carrie's parents live up in rural North Carolina. So when we go up to visit them, that's about a 6-hour car ride. And they always end up being de facto development meetings for Carrie and I, where we will basically use it to pick apart whatever character or story it is at the time that we're working on. And it really gives us the opportunity to really drill down and focus on, all right, well, how do we make this work? In fact, when we were driving to Dink this spring, that was 2 12-hour days both ways, and we got in a lot of development time over that.
Nice. Well, that actually leads us into our next question.
Yeah, I think it's really great that you guys collaborate on this together. So we were wondering what your collaboration process is like. Do you work together, or does one person write the story and the other illustrate? And is there anyone else that you would like to collaborate with in the future?
I think the way the work is, like, split up between us, like, we have our jurisdictions, but we do dabble and, like, help each other. So, for example, Carrie is our lead writer, but she's constantly pinging Alan and me for, like, story feedback, or just, like, asking for input throughout the entire process. So it's not like an assembly line where Carrie writes behind a curtain and then just spits out whatever she wants to Alan and me. And we do have a very, I won't get too deep in the weeds with it, but we do have an interesting page production cycle. Most comics kind of do pencils, inks, and then color. Our process is more like the animation process. So there's a roughs, there's cleaning the art, there's doing the background separately. So that's kind of been interesting collaborating that way as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess that the writing process for us is really unique as a way for comic, because I come from a background of screenwriting and animation. So for that type of writing, we actually follow that kind of format. So everything's usually written out as a screenplay first, and then taken into comic script later. I'm trying to get in the habit of just writing it in comic script, but it's kind of like hard for me to. It's just a whole new perspective, so I'm a little timid about it. But anyway, one of the things that we do that's very unique is even if the comic script is in comic script form, we do what's called a live read through. And this is when we basically bait friends with beer and pizza and say
so it's friends who we've had actors, they tend to be friends who are not afraid to give us like just straightforward feedback, and who kind of like have some understanding of like storytelling mechanics and character development. So we do pick out people who can like provide really good feedback we can act on.
Exactly. The cool thing about working in animation and being artists and working in the comic community is that just by default you kind of find friends who are incredibly talented, who are, willing to give you feedback for beer and pizza. So
and also, like, I mean, the last thing we would ever want for a live read through is a bunch of yes people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If there's no feedback, I'm like a little suspect. Of like, all right, are you guys
Wasted pizza?
Right, exactly. And in any creative endeavor, you need to be open to feedback. So Carrie and I do a podcast, Don Bluth podcast, and we just did like our bit on, or an episode on Troll in Central Park. It's Don Bluth's worst movie, but it's also the movie where he like totally dismissed everyone's feedback and just kind of did it on his own. And as a result, it turned out to be a terrible movie and bombed at the box office. And you see this with George Lucas. You see this with like a lot of other creatives in the past. So I think like I always urge every creative to be open to feedback. That feedback's gonna hurt sometimes. I know like Carrie really does struggle with some of those live readings. So I'm not gonna lie and say it doesn't hurt, but you have to be receptive.
Yeah, you definitely have to be receptive. And usually what happens is like, I know that if I feel really, really hurt about it and I'm not willing to, or I have to fight the will to actually, fight everybody on it, I have to I know that's the moment where I have to step back and I have to kind of detach and I have to say, okay, why do I feel so strongly about this? Because if I can do it in a way that solves my problem and their problem, it's probably going to be better. So it can, I mean, for the third book, for example, we had one of our editors, Rochelle Udell. She worked with White Wolf and all sorts of stuff like that. She's amazing, and she's so good at what she does. I wrote the third script. I showed it to Rochelle, and Rochelle came to me, sat down in my living room, and placed it very gently in front of me and said, Carrie, this is an amazing script. It's really well done. It's well created, well written, but it's not the right story. And I wanted to throttle her. I wanted to jump across my table and wring her neck for like 3 seconds. And then I had to say, okay, why doesn't it work? And she just gave me this whole like laundry list of like things that, questions I wasn't answering. And
this was like months of work for Carrie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This was months of work for me. So it was really kind of insane to come down to basically 3 weeks and like strip out somewhere around 80% of that script and just rewrite everything. But we got a better results out of that.
And the great thing, I'm glad Carrie mentioned Rochelle. You asked about collaborators. Man, we already have the opportunity to work with so many awesome collaborators. Like we rely on our editors to kind of help chisel the story. So Carrie mentioned Rochelle. But there's also DC Brooke. She's a very talented cosplayer. Talin Kell. She's a essayist who writes essays on pop culture and social justice and social issues. And man, they're awesome. Like, they give us so much great feedback, like from perspectives we don't think about. And then and the anthology, like, we're coming out with an anthology. Like, we have these short stories called the Kamikaze Wall Tales. When our first collaboration was with a freaking Eisner-nominated writer.
Yeah, Dan Jolly. He was awesome.
Yeah, so like, and of course we've also worked with Jamel Jones, who was a brilliant artist, Lisa Kirk, Hank Jones, those are brilliant artists, Melissa Jones, Melissa White, sorry, there were so many like Jones in a row.
Yeah, we have like 4 Joneses, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it's only going to get worse here with the anthology.
Yeah.
We've got Aaron O'Neill Jones.
So we've got Aaron Jones, Jamel Jones, Hank Jones, and none of them are related.
No.
Not one of them are related. So.
I mean, at least we can say we're keeping up with the Joneses.
Oh,
my. Alan, did you have to?
How could you?
I'm only marginally sorry.
But yeah, the great thing about collaborating with the people we have worked with is, man, it's so cool to see like other people interpret our work. Alan and Carrie, can you imagine, like, back then when you were first coming up with this idea in college, that you would be working with other people who are creating stories with your characters?
I think we were hoping for that. I think there was never the pretense that this was going to be completely 100% our kid. Mm-hmm. Like, it was always going to have to be something that would grow and other people would have to share with us, and that was going to be a good thing. I don't think we ever quite realized what that journey was going to look like. I think a lot of this has been an education in just what the growing up process for a project like this looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I will say, when you're sort of brought into the idea of animation, like as your sort of foundation of sort of that collaborative process, like, it's weird because people come to us and they say, oh, well, comics can be a very, like, it is collaborative, but it's also very separated. So the writer writes and just hands it over to somebody. And then, okay, so now the artist is doing that, and then it's handed off to the colorist or the inker or the painter or whatever. So, like, everybody's working on their own thing. It's their own spot, but they're all working together in a weird way. But it's very separated versus with animation, like, it can be separated, but you are, like, I don't know, and working in crews and all that kind of stuff with, it's a lot like working in crew on, like, film or plays. Like, you become kind of a family because you're always around each other. You're always working together. If one scene isn't working, you're going to another person and saying, okay, I can't figure this out. Like, what do you think? And getting feedback, and it's always almost instant. So it is a very, very collaborative medium because it has to be, otherwise things just don't get done. And I think what we've done for our project with Kamikaze is we've taken that sort of mentality of creation and applied it to comics as well. So that makes not only our comic look unique and have the quality of artwork that it does, but also the sort of close-knit, almost family that we have around it as well.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting to hear, and I'm sure it hasn't always been easy, and that you've had your share of, arguments and, those hills you choose not to die on. But rather than getting into kind of the specifics of how the comic is made, I actually want to switch gears and talk about the animated series. So it sounds like that was the original concept for this story, but I know that there's a journey there. So did the comic come about because you needed something to have a foundation that you could take to people and say, hey, this is what we want to do for our animated series, or was there always a plan to have a comic?
I will say that for us, it was less of like, hey, let's get this comic made because it'll help with the animated series, and more of, we're tired of people saying no, so we're just going to do it. Like, it wasn't, it was more like we didn't want to have to ask permission to tell our own story, so we just said, hey, we're animators, we can make a comic, and we had no clue what we were doing. And we've learned along the way, like, you don't put 15 panels on a single page, that's bad. And things like that.
And I do want to say, like, I'm kind of proud that I got, like, lettering tips, a little quick lettering lesson from an Eisner-nominated writer, so that's cool.
Yeah, so I think, at least from my point of view, like, we started off definitely with it in the animation camp. We developed it out as a pitch for an animated series, and we spent a long time. Like, Havana came in during that process. We spent about a year and a half developing out that pitch, and at that time it was maybe 2011, 2012 when we first started trotting it around. And this was really before Netflix decided to really get in on creating its own original content. And it was definitely really before the convention scene really proved out the anime market, which allowed things like Crunchyroll to start thinking about their own original content. So we were a little bit of an odd duck when we showed up at some of these pitch conferences, because we were trying to sell them something that they weren't going to want for probably another, half a decade. So we realized that we had something solid. People were telling us we had something solid, but we decided that rather than just keep trying to throw ourselves at these executives and trying to tell them that no, you want to start working on this now because it'll be big later. We said, the important for us right now is we want to get this story told. So why don't we just do what we can, like Carrie's saying, and just give ourselves the permission to do it ourselves.
Well, I think it turned out amazing, and I think I really want it to happen, so...
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's nice about comics and animation and film or anything like that is that, they're basically like reading a movie or reading an animation. They're like the storyboards in some ways, and I think that's one reason why I always fell in love with comics, because movies and animation speak to me as well. So I think it's a fun transition. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think because of the way that we decided to style ours is a little bit more closely bound to that border between animation and comics than a lot of other comics are. And we are very much aware of a frustration a lot of comic creators have, where they feel like sometimes aspiring creators of a film or a TV series will just say, oh, I'll just make a comic and I'll use that to pitch it around. And as soon as I get my thing picked up, then I'll ditch this whole comic thing. And I think we've realized that while we definitely do still want to make this thing an animated series, like, the comic has become an integral part of the way that we tell this story. I don't know how the story or how the comic would evolve if we did get picked up for a full series, but I think we would all try very hard to make sure that the comic kept going and kept growing as its own entity, because it's become such a big part of the way people consume it, and we love that. But yeah, this whole transition point where we're starting to get back into the animation with this Kickstarter is really exciting for us.
Well, yeah. So you currently have a Kickstarter campaign that's going on to get it made into an animated series. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So we launched the Kickstarter. It's been running since about the 11th of November, and it's ending here on the 10th of December. And we're about 80% funded already, and it's both for finishing up the funding for a 10-minute animated short. It's going to be 2D animated in the same style that the comic's done in. And on top of that, we're also raising money for this comics anthology, which is going to tie together a bunch of these wall tales that Havana was talking about earlier, and also unifying it with a whole bunch of new stories written by folks like Robert Jeffrey, John Robinson IV. And we just announced Talon Cal is going to be writing the 5th story if we can hit our first stretch goal. And we've been able to work with some really fantastic folks on the animation so far. We've tapped Echo Bridge Pictures, which is based out of Florida. They'll be doing the animation. They do some great, fantastic, punchy animation. And we've got some great voice actors on board, too. We've got Monica Rial and Danny Chambers, who are both seasoned veterans of the anime voiceover world.
Yeah, if you've seen any anime in your life, you've heard them. Like, their filmography is insane.
Yeah. And we've also got some really cool newcomers, too. We've got Jonathan Young, who a lot of folks who are in the YouTube scene know very well. He does sort of these heavy metal covers of Disney villain songs and stuff like that. And he's been really, really excited about the opportunity to kind of jump into the role of Toro, and he's done a fantastic job. We did a sort of a promo reel for that, and to release during the Kickstarter, and I got chills listening to it.
Yeah, I will say I'm also very excited about another actor that we have just announced today. His name is Lee Shorten, and he was in Man in the High Castle and AMC's recent sort of horror series called The Terror Infamy, which talks about the camps that they put the Japanese folks into. So both of them are very, very good. He does a really, really good job, and we actually have him cast as Toshi, who is Markeisha's father, and their relationship is one that a lot of people I think are very excited to see. So we actually have a stretch goal where we'll be able to do an after credit scene with Markeisha and her dad, which kind of ties everything very beautifully together, but at the same time kind of makes you want to have more because it hints at other things. So we're really excited about that bit. And then, of course, we've got two other newcomers we have is Kevin Pakulan. He is he's out of Seattle, I believe. And then Damon Alms, who is out of California. And both of them are just so, so phenomenal. And I have to admit, Kevin kind of warms my heart because he is very attached to the character he plays, who's Link. We had them do a little bit of like a questionnaire kind of thing where they sort of film themselves answering some questions, and he was the only one who kind of low key cosplayed as his character for those questions.
Which is pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, one of the exciting things about seeing this animated short come together is, like, first, the three of us, animation fans, like, obsessed with the animation process. I think it's, like, I mean, as a kid growing up, I loved those behind-the-scenes kind of, like, making of featurettes from the Disney company and DreamWorks and everything. So it's just so cool to see, like, the storyboards come together and the animatics come together, and then, like, hearing the dialogue come together, and, like, it's just all very surreal, and it's just very exciting. And I'm learning so much throughout the process, and, like, I didn't expect to get so emotional, like, hearing the actual characters. We've been working on these characters for 7 freaking years. We are all kind of in tune with how the characters act and behave and believe and feel, but until we actually heard them, it was just like, oh my god, that's Markeisha or that's Link. And in a few cases, like, they've even elevated those characters and made them even better, which is always amazing.
That's really, really exciting.
It is.
And we're really excited to share that goal with our listeners and with the people we know. So just to wrap up here, where can we find all this information? Where can we find your work?
Well, you can read the comic for free at kamikazecomic.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Kamikaze Comic. On Facebook and Instagram, we are Kamikaze Animated. Because we had trouble deciding which to do for which phase. Yeah, that's where you can find any of that information. The Kickstarter URL is horrifically difficult to try to pronounce over the air. I think that probably the best way to find us is either to go to Twitter and find us at Kamikaze Comic, or go to kamikazecomic.com, and I have pasted the link to the Kickstarter all over that. It's very hard to miss.
And we'll also share that link in the description of this podcast episode.
Mm-hmm.
No, I will also, on top of that, with the Kickstarter, we have a lot of like really cool back rewards included too. So at the various levels, you can get all kinds of swag. You can get the comics themselves as well. So we have 2 volumes that are actually out in print now. The third one is still in the works, but yeah, there's lots of stuff coming down. Oh, and also like we have some like new things coming out as backer rewards too. We mentioned the anthology, but also Marcus Williams of Tuskegee Airs. He made this fantastic poster. Like I kind of want it on a shirt, honestly. But yeah, it's pretty exciting. So if you're a Marcus Williams fan, you are a collector of his work. Well, we got a print.
Right. Yeah, we've got a lot of fantastic rewards. And here's something I want to say. I want to thank every single one of our backers who's backed so far. And if you haven't backed yet, please feel free to come and support us. We are getting really close to our backer, to our funding goal, but we definitely, every donation will help, not only to get us to our baseline funding goal, but then to get us up to the point where we can add in Tallinn, to where we can get an added Lee Shorten. We only have a few more days left. I don't want to leave it to chance, but I just want to express how grateful we are to everyone who is a backer and who has supported us up to this point, because ultimately this project has been fueled by not only our own passion, but by the passion and response we get from all of our fans.
Absolutely. And I want to add, because I learned that this was a concern with a potential backer. A lot of backers are nervous about backing projects because some of them never see the light of day. One of the unique things about this Kickstarter is that this animated short is actually in production now. So it's guaranteed to be out. We just needed to kind of close a little bit of a gap, and we need your help. And also, this is a great way to kind of distribute a lot of the new merchandise we've come out with over the past couple of years. So even though the momentum has been incredible, I can't believe the number of amazing like actors and writers and comic artists who have already retweeted us, backed us. We still need that help closing the gap over the next, I think it's less than a week now. But any help would be great. And retweeting and sharing the link is going to be an amazing help to us as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for doing this with us. It was really, really fun. We love to hear people talk about their work and their inspirations and their processes. And you guys sound like you have such an amazing dynamic. And that shows. The product is amazing. Mm-hmm. And I can't wait to see what comes out next.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah, this was fun.
Well, we would like to thank Havana Nguyen, Carrie Tupper, and Alan Tupper for sharing an evening with us to tell us all about their comic, Kamikaze. That is, fingers crossed, well, it's getting an animated short, but hopefully a full animated series. Please look at the link in our description so that you can support their campaign.
Yeah. So this has been another exciting episode of File 741. I'm Leigh.
And I'm Beckah.
Thank you for listening, and please like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can tune in to all of our podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, or at thefeminerdfiles.net.